and thank you for joining me here at Why the Book Wins. My name is Laura, and today I'm here to talk about Dr. Sleep, which is a book written by Stephen King, published in 2013, and the movie adaptation was released in 2019 and is directed by Mike Flanagan. And the reason I am covering Dr. Sleep is because it won a poll I posted on my YouTube community page, so definitely subscribe to my YouTube channel because I do post polls about every other month or so. I like having my subscribers help me choose what my upcoming book first movie content is. Also follow me on Instagram, and yeah, take part in the Why the Book Wins community by voting in these polls that I post. But before getting into Dr. Sleep, I want to warn you there will be spoilers for both the book and the movie, and there will also be spoilers for both the book and the movie The Shining. I do have a book first movie episode for The Shining that I recorded in January, so if you want to check that out before watching this video, I will link to it. Because yeah, we talk about that one a lot in this one, because Dr. Sleep is basically a sequel of sorts. And I did order a first edition copy of Dr. Sleep, however it has not yet arrived, so I decided to have The Shining on display instead, because that is very fitting for this episode. So to get into a brief summary for the book and movie, so Dr. Sleep is the story of Danny Torrance, who is the child in The Shining. And so it begins with his life after he leaves the Overlook, but we very quickly just move on to him being an adult, and he has now become an alcoholic. And we see him when he hits rock bottom, when he wakes up in this woman's apartment who he had spent the night with, and he steals her money, even though she clearly is poor and not in a good position. He steals her money anyway, and he also sees that she has a toddler who is being abused, but he just takes her money and leaves, and that is his like rock bottom moment in his life. And after this, he just continues his self-destructive behavior until he arrives in the town New Hampshire, and once there he feels Tony's presence for the first time in a really long time, telling him that this is where he's meant to be. And he gets a job and he stays sober for like a day or two, but he very quickly wants to drink again. And his coworker Billy sees him with a bottle of alcohol, struggling with wanting to drink but not wanting to drink, and turns out their boss Casey is a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. So Billy tells Casey this, and Casey becomes Dan's sponsor in AA and helps him get sober, and Dan is on the road to recovery. And while we are hearing about Dan's story, we are also being told about the True Knot, which is this group of people who were once humans, and when they were human they had different versions of the Shining, but then at one point in their lives they were like transformed, kind of like with vampires. A vampire can turn someone else into a vampire, so the True Knot can find someone with the Shining and make them a member of the True Knot, and they become these like long living beings. They're not immortal because they can still be killed by things that can kill humans, but they can live a super long time, like for decades, for centuries, if they take in people's steam. And they take the steam, which is like a person's essence, I guess, and they take in the steam of people who have the Shining, children who have the Shining, because the Shining is stronger in children. And so they take the steam from children, and that is what causes them to live so long. And while, you know, stuff with Dan and stuff with the True Knot is happening, we're also hearing about this child named Abra, who is super powerful in the Shining, like even more powerful than Danny's Shining was in The Shining. And she and Dan live like one town over, and so even though they've never met, they have this psychic connection, and they will talk through this chalkboard in Dan's room, and so she will write on it like telekinetically, or whatever the word is, and when he writes back she can see, and so they have this communication that way even though they've never met, and they don't even know who the other person is. But at one point the True Knot kills this boy, the baseball boy, and Abra senses this, and she like can see it happening, and Rose the Hat is the leader of the True Knot, and she can sense that Abra is watching them. And so Rose can feel Abra's power, her Shining, and so she's like, wow, we gotta get this girl because she has some powerful steam, which will in turn give us a lot of power. So eventually Dan and Abra meet in person, and she kind of tells him about what she experienced with the baseball boy and with Rose the Hat. Dan and his friends help Abra fight off the True Knot, and so Rose is just desperate to get Abra because it's hurting her pride that they're not able to. But there's also like this other side story where people of the True Knot are dying of a disease, and she thinks Abra's steam will help save them. So she wants her out of desperation because the True Knot are dying, but also because it hurts her pride that she can't get her because it keeps not working when they try to. Anyway, thanks to the help of Dan and his friends, Abra and Dan are able to overpower the True Knot and kill Rose in the end, and it happens where the Overlook once stood, or in the movie, the Overlook is still there. But anyway, it all culminates where the Overlook is, and that is where the showdown happens, and they beat the True Knot and kill Rose. So onto the book review. I was surprised how much this book really is its own story. I thought it would be more of like a direct sequel where you had to have read The Shining in order to appreciate Dr. Sleep. And obviously there's Shining references and, you know, the showdown happens where the Overlook was. But even so, you could go into this not having read the Overlook and you would still, like, you wouldn't be lost because it really is just its own story. And The Shining felt very personal to King, and that's one of the reasons I love it, is you can tell it's so personal to him in regards to addiction and family violence. And Dr. Sleep is the same because addiction plays a huge part, and it's interesting to see how he writes about addiction in The Shining versus Dr. Sleep, because when he wrote The Shining, he was still in his alcoholism, whereas for Dr. Sleep, he's been sober for quite some time. And in the afterword, he writes, "People change. The man who wrote Dr. Sleep is very different from the well-meaning alcoholic who wrote The Shining, but both remain interested in the same thing, telling a kick-ass story. I enjoyed finding Danny Torrance again and following his adventures, and I hope you did too. And if that's the case, constant reader, we're all good." By the way, I'm wearing this shirt because Stephen King fans are called constant reader, and it is the middle of summer and it is crazy hot. And this is long sleeve, but I am dedicated and I'm wearing it anyway despite the heat. Obviously we have AC, but anyway. But yeah, getting back to the book. So it's interesting too because Jack Torrance does not have a happy ending in The Shining, whereas Danny does. And so I feel like that's just reflective of where King is in his life and with his addiction. And there is just so much AA throughout this whole book, and I really love that. And as someone who is familiar with the world of AA and Al-Anon, I just love seeing that representation of, you know, giving us an alcoholic who is trying to better his life and is trying to overcome his addiction and be a good person and make the right choices, and just showing the strength of that community and how they help each other out. Yeah, I just loved it. And there's AA quotes all over the place in this book, and it was fantastic. And yeah, I just love to seeing Dan overcome this cycle of family addiction because his dad was an alcoholic, his dad's dad was an alcoholic. I'm sure his great-great-grandfather was too. And so Dan is the person breaking this cycle and getting sober and doing what his dad had been unable to do. But yeah, overall, I was just really surprised how much I liked this book. And it seems like a lot of other people feel that way too, where maybe they went into this book being like, having low expectations, but then being like, wow, this was actually a great story. So I would highly recommend it. And again, even if you haven't read The Shining, which you should, because The Shining is amazing, but Dr. Sleep is still a fantastic book that I would highly recommend. And I was surprised how much I loved it. I gave it 4 stars though, not 5, because for multiple reasons, which we will get into. But yeah, it just wasn't as much of an like on the edge of your seat page turner like The Shining was, but the good guys also just win way too easily in the book, but we'll get into it. And onto the movie review. So I remember hearing about this movie when it came out, but I honestly had no interest. I love The Shining, but hearing this one, I was just like, a Shining sequel, like 40 years after the movie has come out? Like, no thank you. And I had 0 interest. Also, I was worried it would be too scary for me. And so that was one reason why, you know, even though I covered The Shining in January, I didn't rush to cover Dr. Sleep because yeah, I just thought it would be too scary, which ultimately it wasn't. Like I didn't get nightmares or anything from the book or the movie. So yeah, it's definitely not like as much of a horror as you would think. Like The Shining scared me more for sure than Dr. Sleep did, which The Shining, the book, the movie The Shining doesn't give me nightmares, but yeah, the book was pretty scary. Anyway, after reading this book, I looked at the movie on IMDb and it has a 7.3. And so the fact that I loved the book so much and that the movie had a high review on there, I went into the movie super excited and I couldn't wait, and I had fairly high expectations. And to be honest, it did not disappoint. I loved this movie. I think it was a great adaptation of Dr. Sleep while also paying homage to the book and the movie The Shining, which is a hard thing to do because the book and the movie are so different. And the performances are incredible. Like child actors can be so hit or miss, but Kylie Curran is amazing in this as Abra. I was so impressed. She was fantastic. And then we have Jacob Tremblay, who was in Room, which I did a book versus movie for. He plays the baseball boy. And this is a small role, but it's a very important role. And he was incredible. And the baseball boy scene, like they go for it in the movie. And to be honest, I skipped over some of it, but he was incredible in those scenes. And then Ewan McGregor, of course, was fantastic as Danny, but honestly, I think the role that stood out the most was Rebecca Ferguson as Rose the Hat. She was incredible, and I absolutely loved every time she was on screen. But like I said, though, everyone was amazing, so it's not like I was ever bored when we were focusing on Danny or when we were focusing on Abra. Like, I was happy no matter who was on screen. But yeah, Rebecca Ferguson was fantastic. But this is a very faithful adaptation for like the first 2/3 of the movie, but the end is very different, and so there is quite a bit to get into here. And starting with the beginning, this is a very crucial part to the book and movie, but we start when Danny is young, and they have escaped the Overlook, but Danny is still being visited by ghosts from the Overlook. And so Dick Halloran, if you'll remember, he is the guy who also has The Shining, who helped Danny in The Shining. He meets up with Danny and he tells him about about these mental lock boxes Danny can create in his mind. And so he creates these lock boxes, and using his shining, he's able to trap these ghosts in these boxes. And so he basically has like all of these mental lock boxes that are filled with different ghosts from the Overlook, which keep coming back to haunt him. And that is how he is able to lock them away. They don't bother him anymore. And by the way, in the book, Dick Hallorann lives in the end. So he like physically comes because Wendy calls him and he helps Danny. Whereas in the movie, it's like his ghost, his spirit, is the one who tells Danny about the lock boxes. And then to talk more about Dan's rock bottom, so in the beginning of Dan's adult life, we see what he later considers as his deepest moment, and that is this memory that he just can't bring himself to tell anybody else because he just feels so much shame and regret about it. And the movie has this scene as well where he wakes up next to Deanie, that is the name of the woman, and then he sees that she has a toddler, but he takes her money anyway and he leaves them. The movie leaves out the fact that the toddler was being abused by Deanie's brother, so the toddler's uncle was abusing him, but the movie leaves that part out. And the movie also just doesn't show what an impact this memory had on him for the next 15 years. Like, it's something he just hates thinking about and he can't talk about. And the movie, we do see him like have a dream or a vision of Deanie and the toddler like being ghostly and dead, but we're not clear if it's a dream or if it's like a real vision of them. Whereas in the book, he has a dream with them, and in this dream he finds out that the toddler was killed by the brother and Deanie then committed suicide. And so knowing what happened to them because he abandoned them, which he only knew them for that one night, but still the fact that he didn't do anything to help them and they ended up dying, he is just filled with just so much guilt and shame over this. But yeah, the movie definitely downplays it, and it doesn't seem to have quite the impact on Dan that it had in the book. And part of the AA 12 steps is confessing like everything you've ever done that's bad to another living person. But Dan has this secret which he just can't bring himself to tell anybody, and his sponsor tells him the phrase where you're only as sick as your secrets, but even so Dan just can't talk about it. And this does come full circle in the end of the book, but we'll get to that later. And in the movie, Dr. Dalton offers him the job of being a janitor at a hospice when he first arrives in New Hampshire. In the book, I think it's like implied that Dan had worked in hospices in the past, and so Dr. Dalton doesn't offer him the job. Like when Dan first arrives, he gets a job in like Teeny Town with Billy, but then after the season ends, he applies to the hospice and gets a job there. Whereas in the movie, he meets Dr. Dalton in an AA meeting, and Dr. Dalton offers him the job in the hospice as a janitor. And in the movie, he first helps someone pass on. It seems like he has never done this before. Like a cat walks into a room and he follows the cat, and then the guy tells him, if the cat's here, that means I'm about to die. And so Dan, like unintentionally, helps this man pass on by the fact that he can like read his mind, and so he can help soothe him and calm him and just put him at ease. And Dan also knows that life doesn't stop after death, and so that knowledge too, he is able to help bring comfort to those as they pass on. And as he is helping this guy, before he dies calls him Dr. Sleep. And that is how he gets his name. And then from here we flash forward like 8 years and we see Dan helping someone else pass on. And both of these scenes, especially the second scene though, when we see Dan 8 years later, clearly he's been doing this for a while now. And it was a really touching scene and really beautiful as he helps this man pass on to the next stage in his life and helps bring him comfort and ease as he passes on. And yeah, it was just really beautifully done. I wish we would have had more scenes like that, because in the book it is more of a thing, but in the movie we just get those 2 scenes. And in the book we don't see like the moment he becomes Dr. Sleep, we just see him helping people pass on, and then we flash forward to the future and people are calling him Dr. Sleep, so it's just a thing. But I really love the way death was talked about in this book and the reverence and respect Dan has for death. And there's a line that reads, "Death was no less a miracle than birth." And I just really love that. Like, that is a line that has stuck with me. And ever since I finished the book, which I finished it, I don't know, like a week ago, not that long ago. But anyway, that line has really stuck with me, and it's just really beautiful. And I really just love the way death is represented in this book. But yeah, in the book, guiding people into death, into sleep, is something that comes into play later. And in general, we just get more of him in the hospice. And so the name Dr. Sleep is more fitting for the book. Whereas in the movie, him being Dr. Sleep and helping people in death doesn't really come into play in any of the major events. And so the title is like more fitting for the book than it is the movie. However, I'm still glad the movie kept the same name because it is a really cool title. But yeah, it's funny because I felt the same way about The Shining. Like, the title, The Shining, is so fitting for the book. It's perfect. But for the movie, I remember before I read the book, I was kind of confused why it was called The Shining. And so it's the same with Dr. Sleep, where it's such a fitting name for the book. And in the movie, like, it still works, but the book, it just applies so much more. But yeah, like I said, the first like 2/3 of the movie are very similar to the book. The movie does like rush the timeline a bit, which is to be expected, but they kept a lot of the plot exactly the same. But one change though is with some of the characters. So for example, Dr. Dalton is a huge part of the book. He is Abra's pediatrician and he is an AA member with Dan. And so he knows both of them, and that comes into play later because when they're convincing Abra's parents, that what Dan is saying is true, the fact that Dr. Dalton is there helps Abra's parents believe him because they have this connection right there. And Dr. Dalton is the one that goes with him to get the baseball boys baseball mitt, and he's there at the ambush they have at the picnic, and like he's there for everything. Whereas in the movie, like he's there in an AA meeting and he offers Dan the job and then he's gone and that's it. So Billy kind of takes the place of Dr. Dalton because Billy is the one that goes with him to get the baseball glove and he's there helping him out. And Billy is also Dan's sponsor, whereas in the book it was Casey, this other guy, but they get rid of Casey entirely. So I don't mind that they condensed characters, but I do wish they had Dr. Dalton because that helped Abra's family trust Dan. Whereas in the movie, they get Abra's parents to believe him by Abra just like using her powers on her dad to get him to see the truth, which that works too, but yeah. Oh, and also in the book, Billy was a much older man, and at one point Dan helps save his life because he sees like death flies when someone is close to dying, and he sees a few on Billy's face, and so he gets him to go to a doctor, and it ends up saving Billy's life, and that wasn't in the movie. But to move on to the True Knot specifically, so the True, like I said, all of them have some kind of power, like they all shine in some way. Like Rose the Hat can read minds, and she can also enter into minds, and she can like sense the location of different people, like where they are, who shine. And so there's different members who also can sense location, and there's Andy the snake, and she can cause people to fall asleep. In the movie, they say that, she can push and convince people to do anything, which that's in Firestarter. Andy, that's what they call it, is pushing, because he can convince people to do anything. But in the book, Andy could only get people to fall asleep. And that was it. But anyway, and then there's another girl who is really good at like camouflaging herself. And yeah, they all have different powers of some sort. And in the book, we learned that like when they feed on the steam, their jaw like dislocates and they have this giant tusk that comes down. So pretty weird. I thought the movie would have that because it definitely would have made it creepy, but they didn't. So they just look pretty normal. Their eyes glow, but it's nothing too crazy. But in the book, like a couple years, 1 or 2 years after the baseball boy, one of them gets the measles and then he dies. And so it turns out like the baseball boy had measles, and because they had his steam, the True is now getting measles. And because they're not as strong, like because they don't have as much steam as they used to, they're not as strong and they therefore are dying of the measles. And so this is why Rose really wants to get Abra's, because she thinks that that will help save them from the measles. And it just gives her the sense of urgency to get Abra. Whereas the movie leaves out the measles aspect. We do have like Grandpa Flick is the first one to die in the book from the measles, and he dies as well in the movie. But in the movie, it's because there just isn't as much steam in the world, and the steam that there isn't as powerful, and so they're weaker. And she has this phrase where she says, eat well, live long. But if they're not eating well, they can't live long. So she does have a sense of urgency in the book, but it's for a different reason from book to movie. And in the book, after the death of like Crow and the other members that go and are ambushed at the picnic, a lot of members of the True just want to stop and not try to get Abra anymore because clearly it's too risky because they're dying because Abra is so powerful. However, Rose is still determined to get Abra, and so because of this, it causes different members of the True to just leave Rose and start their own groups. And so she still has some people that are left, but the numbers have definitely dwindled. Whereas in the book, the numbers of the True start dwindling just because they die off. There aren't like people leaving because of this, like there was in the book. But I did like that in the book, King included certain moments that made you see like the love the True Knot has for each other and their loyalty to some extent, aside from, they start abandoning Rose when she gets obsessed over Abra. But anyway, they do have this like love to each other. And obviously like they are evil. But, when Andy the snake is close to death, you see her in the book, not the movie necessarily, but you see her, her past traumas coming to the surface, and it makes her seem more human. And then we also get the scene where, like showing the love for they have each other again, the scene where Grandpa Flick is dying and Rose, he says that he's scared to die, and Rose talks to him about how incredible he is and how he shouldn't be scared and, he's amazing, whatever. But I really love that scene because it shows Rose as being a kind of a Dr. Sleep herself, right? Because she's guiding Grandpa Flick into death and by comforting him and soothing him. So I thought that was a really great scene. And I also loved how the True Knot is basically, they look like any other group of RVers. And King even says in his afterword, let me close with a word of caution. When you're on the turnpikes and freeways of America, watch out for those Winnebagos and Bounders. You never know who might be inside. or what? And I love when books will use this, like something that we see in our everyday lives, and they make it part of the story because it sticks with you. And now whenever I do see those RV groups, I'm gonna be thinking of the True Knot. So it's just a fun way to incorporate it into your own life. So I'm kind of skipping some of the beginning parts, but basically Rose sends people after Abra. She herself can't go because Abra knows what she looks like because they saw each other in that vision when they like trade places and stuff. But anyway, so Rose sends some people to get Abra. However, Dan and them play this trick because Abra can like be in Dan's mind. And so Dan goes with Abra's dad to go have this picnic, and Abra will like ping inside his mind so that they sense that Abra is there at this picnic, like the person who can locate Abra thinks she's there at this picnic because she mentally is there when really she's physically at home. And so when the True are at this picnic, they see that Abra isn't there after all, and it's an ambush, and Dan and his friends are there, and they battle it out with the True Knot, and they end up winning. However, in the movie, Andy the Snake, or Andy the Snakebite, whatever she's called, anyway, as she's dying, because she has the power to convince people to do anything, she tells Billy to shoot himself, which he does, and Billy dies in the movie, whereas in the book, like I said, Andy could get people to fall asleep, but that was it. And she tries to get Dan to fall asleep, but then he comes out of it. Anyway, ultimately, they kill the members of the True. In the book, everybody lives and it's all good, but in the movie, Billy dies. And in both book and movie, we find out that Crow had been dropped off at Abra's home just to be safe, and so he is able to get her since that is where she physically is. And in the book, this happens too, but Billy had been watching Abra, and Abra had been staying at a friend's house to help keep her safe, but Abra is just so mentally exhausted at having to be two places at once that she decides to go home so she can relax a bit more. And Crow sees her leaving her friend's house, and he sees Billy, and so he tranquilizes Billy. He goes, tranquilizes Abra, and he kidnaps Abra in Billy's truck. And he kidnaps her in the movie as well, but Billy isn't there. So in the movie, it's just Abra, whereas in the book, it's Billy and Abra he kidnaps. And so when Abra wakes up, she is like just super out of it from the tranquilizer. However, she is still able to communicate with Dan, and Dan is able to get inside her mind. And so he basically is able to possess her, sort of, and he uses his powers as well as some of Abra's powers, plus Billy wakes up and they are able to overpower Crow Daddy, and which his full name is Crow Daddy. Anyway, they're able to overpower him and he dies, and then Billy drives them to a hotel where they wait till the next morning when they can meet up with the others. Whereas in the book, it's the same, like it's just Abra though no Billy, and she's like super loopy from the drugs, but Dan is able to like possess her, and he causes Crow to crash the car and he dies. And then Abra gets out and she walks to a hotel where she waits for Dan to pick her up. And this scene in the movie was so well done where Abra was Dan, and again, Curran's performance right here was so fantastic. And I read that Ian McGregor played out the scene first, and then Abra just mimicked how he was in the scene. So yeah, great acting on her part. But to talk about Abra's family real fast, so in the book we learned that Abra's mom, Lucy, was raised by Conchetta, her grandmother. And long story short, so we find out that Jack Torrance, Dan's dad, had an affair with Lucy's mom, and Lucy's mom got pregnant. However, by the time she found out she was pregnant, I guess the Torrance family had gone to Colorado. And so she gives birth to Lucy, Abra's mom, but then the mom dies young, and so then Lucy is raised by Conchetta. And so yeah, basically Dan is Abra's niece. And we got hints of this throughout the story of like different mannerisms she had that was similar to Jack or Dan. And then when they're driving to the picnic, Abra's dad is there talking to Dan as if he's Abra, and he's just kind of rambling, and he talks about how they don't know who's Lucy's dad. And so as soon as that was said, where they didn't know who the dad was, I like sensed that they were going to make it be Jack would be the dad, and that was the case. And it was a little cliche, but I didn't mind too much. And when Dan himself has this realization that he and Abra are related, he goes to see Conchetta, who is dying of cancer, and so he's able to confirm that he is in fact Abra's uncle. And then they also have this separate conversation, which we don't overhear, but we know they had talked about something important. And we later find out that what had gone on between them was that she agreed to like give him her essence when she died because it was the cancer, and he locks it in his lockbox. And so after this conversation with her, we see that he is very sick, and the book makes it seem like he's sick because of the stress of it all. But then at one point he looks in the mirror and he has the death flies on his face, and so it seems like he's gonna die in the future when he has his showdown with Rose. However, ultimately the reason this happens is because he has the cancer within himself, but the reader doesn't know that till later. And this whole thing with the cancer cancer and them being related is left out of the movie. And so to talk about the book ending, so in the book, the True own a campground because they have all their RVs. They own a campground where the Overlook once stood. And so even though the Overlook isn't there, like, you know, they can still sense the evil that was there, and the True Knot likes that. And so they bought the land and built a campground right around there. And this is obviously very significant for Dan, the fact that he is returning to where the Overlook once stood. And so after escaping from Crow, they formed this plan, and Abra calls up Rose, and she gets Rose just really riled up and angry. And so she is so angry that Abra is able to call the shots, and she tells Rose, like, we're gonna meet you at your RV park, and it's gonna be me and you one-on-one. So all of your other members of the True Knot, have them stay in this other building, and they need to stay there while you and I meet at the top of this hill, and we're gonna have our showdown. And so they pull the same trick from earlier where mentally Abra is with Dan, but physically she's still at home. And so Rose thinks Abra is showing up because she can like sense her approaching, but really it's just Abra's mind. And once they get there, they have a doll in the car pretending to be Abra, and Rose is so far away that she can't tell it's not real. And Billy's driving the car. And so while Rose is distracted with this, Dan and like Abra's mind, the two of them go to the meeting house where all of the other members are at, and he releases the cancer he has been keeping in this lockbox, and it kills the members of the True Knot. And Rose can sense when someone dies, and so she can sense that, she was tricked and that all the other members are now dead. And so she eventually meets up with Abra, mental Abra and physical Dan, and they have a last showdown. However, it ends with them pushing Rose over the cliff and she dies. And it seems like the ghost of Jack helps them overpower Rose. And there is this moment where Rose is in Dan's head and she's able to convince him that, like, I don't remember if it's Deanie or if it's Rose, but he sees someone that he doesn't like. And so he starts to strangle them, but really it's Abra. However, he catches himself in time and he, stops himself from hurting her. So that was like the only hitch in their plan, but for the most part, it goes very smooth and nobody dies. And there was this other member of the True Knot hiding in a shed. However, Dan releases the ghost of some of the other Overlook people like Horace DeWitt, and he ends up killing this lady that was hiding in the shed. So again, everything just worked out too well and it just went too smoothly. And there was the whole thing where he tries to strangle Abra, but that was it. And it just felt too easy. But I did like the touch of Jack's ghost helping them out. And then in the end, like, Jack's ghost waves to Dan before Dan and Billy head back home. But in the movie ending, so the True don't live where the Overlook is, and Dan decides he and Abra are going to drive to the Overlook and lure Rose there. And his logic is that the Overlook, their ghosts will be just as bad for Rose as it is for them, which is totally different because, like I said, in the book they liked staying at the Overlook because of like presence there, I guess, whereas in the movie the ghosts are evil for Rose too. Also in the movie, Abra like physically is there with him, it's not just mentally. And so they drive up there, and on the drive her mom calls her because her mom shows up, and the husband is dead because her dad died when Crow kidnapped Abra, which is different because the dad lives in the book. Anyway, so the mom comes home, sees her husband is dead, and she calls up Abra asking where she is, and Abra just says, I love you, Mom, and then she throws her phone out the window because she knows she can't really give her any details until it's all over. And again, great performance by Curran in this moment, Abra, because just the sadness, but the determination and the knowledge that this is just the way it has to be. So that was a great scene. But once they get to the hotel, Dan tells Abra to stay in the car, and he's like, let me know when you see Rose's headlights approaching because you can see it from a ways off. And he's like, I'm gonna go wake up the hotel. So he goes inside, and I guess his shining kind of helps wake it up, but he also turns on the electricity and he gets the boiler going, and then he's going around the hotel and there's like different flashbacks to The Shining the movie, and then he goes to the bar, the very bar his dad drank at, and the bartender there is Jack, and Jack kind of tries to tempt him to drink, but Danny, refuses and doesn't give in. And then Rose shows up, Abra comes in and tells her Rose is here, and then as Rose is walking through the Overlook, again, we have a lot more scenes that are recreating moments from the movie, and when they're driving to the Overlook too, it's the same shot from the movie and it has that same music. But they get Rose to think that she is in Abra's brain, when really she is in Dan's brain. However, once, she realizes, she is able to get out, and once she comes out of Dan's mind, once she realizes the trick, Abra, like Dan tells her to run away, and so she goes off into another part of the hotel, and Dan and Rose have this battle, and we have a recreation of that iconic staircase scene where they're walking up the staircase. But ultimately, Rose is able to injure Dan, but then Dan is able to release the Overlook ghosts, and they end up killing Rose. However, after they kill Rose, they turn on Dan and they end up possessing him. Dan, when he's possessed by the Overlook, goes to the room where Abra is, And then this scene is a recreation from the end of the book, The Shining, because in the end of the book, Jack has become possessed by the Overlook, but he has a moment of clarity where he saves Danny. And that's what happens here. So he meets up with Abra and she says how, it's not really Dan, you're the Overlook and you're lying and you're just a mask. So it's like some of the exact same lines that Danny had in The Shining. Anyway, Dan is about to hurt her, but then himself, Dan is able to come through enough and he stops himself from hurting her and he tells her to get away. And so she's able to run away. And she also tells him, Dan turned on the boiler when he first got here. And so it needs to let out the steam, but you haven't done it yet. And that means the Overlook is going to blow up. And again, this happened exactly in the book, The Shining. That's what happened. Anyway, so Abra is able to escape because Dan comes through enough to stop the Overlook. But then he goes down to the basement to turn off the boiler. But then he doesn't turn it off and he just lets it go and it explodes and he dies in the Overlook while Abra watches from outside. And I love that they incorporated the end of The Shining and the end of Dr. Sleep because I just loved that ending and that moment between Dan and Jack, and when Jack is able to come through enough to help save Danny, and it was such a great scene in the book. And so I really do love that they incorporated it into the movie, Dr. Sleep. However, I wish Dan would have survived, because he was stronger than Jack. And so I feel like he should have been able to overpower the ghosts enough. So in that last moment when he pulls through, he should have been able to pull through all the way. And he and Abra should have both been able to run out of the hotel and then the hotel blows up. So I love that they incorporated the ending, but I wish Dan would have survived. We do see though in the end, Abra having a conversation with the ghost Dan. So he's still part of her life, but he died. So that was a huge difference right there. But I do want to talk some more just about the alcoholism and the AA aspect of this book, because again, it plays such a huge part. And in the movie, we do see a few times where he is in AA meetings, and including one where he receives a chip for his 8th birthday, and he makes a speech saying how this is in honor of my dad. But like I said, in the book, AA is such a bigger part, and there's AA quotes all over the place. But I also liked too, just that King decided to make Danny become an alcoholic to begin with, right? Because one quote early on reads, "This was what he thought then. Of course, he also thought he would never take a drink, not after seeing what it had done to his father. Sometimes we just get it wrong." And in Dan's case, he has the shine, which can be very overpowering, but he also has his memories of the Overlook, and so those things cause him to drink as a way to dim the shining and to also just forget these horrible memories he has. So it's understandable he drinks, but even in real life, so many people are raised by violent alcoholics, and you would think after seeing what happened, how could they possibly drink? But it does happen, and so often they become alcoholics themselves. And so I think it is very true to reality that Dan himself would have become an alcoholic. And similar to my episode for Misery and The Shining, I just want to share some quotes that I really liked that pertain to addiction. "I am the incredible shrinking man," he thought, hurrying around the corner with his new prize. "Steal a few more things and I will vanish entirely from sight." So just showing how demeaning it makes him feel, and he keeps stooping lower and lower and feeling smaller and smaller. And then another one, "Times when he felt worthless and the booze seemed like all he deserved. At times like that, he felt very close to his father." And he thought, "The only one who can put on the brakes is you." This thought had come to him many times before, but now it followed by a new one. "You don't have to live this way if you don't want to. You can, of course, but you don't have to." And I love that last one in particular because alcoholics know, it's up to me. I'm the only one who can stop this. But that following thought where it's you don't have to live this way. You can, but you don't have to. And how that thought gives him more freedom. And I think it's also just being kinder to yourself too. And it's not guilt tripping himself being I'm the only one who has to stop. I need to stop this. I'm a terrible person. Instead, it's just you don't have to live this way. So I thought that was a really great quote. And then also the quote from when Dan asks Billy, he's like, "How did you know I was an alcoholic?" And he says, "It's because the way Dan was holding the bottle," and it says, "It was the way he held the bottle, hating it and loving it and needing it all at the same time." And we do get a scene in the movie where he is tempted to drink, and it is after Abra has been kidnapped and the dad has died, and he sees a bottle of alcohol and he takes it and he goes up to his room and he's so tempted to drink, and he has this back and forth, but ultimately he resists and he throws the bottle. And also I wanted to mention how in AA, a big part of it is once you have a lot of sobriety, you keep attending the meetings to help the newcomers. And so it is now your job to help guide these new people on the road to recovery. And that mirrors what Dan is doing with Abra, because Abra is newer with The Shining, and Dan, an old timer, is helping guide her through her journey with The Shining. So I thought that was cool. And I wanted to talk about the very end of the book, because at the very end, Dan is celebrating his 15-year birthday of sobriety. And when he gets up to share, he is finally able to share the experience he had with Deanie and her son. And it's such a big moment for him because he has been building this up so much. But then when he tells it, the people in the AA meeting like aren't that fazed, and Dan realizes how he was building it up so much in his mind, thinking that they would be appalled and disgusted by him, when really like they're all members of AA and they themselves have experienced these low moments in their lives, and so it's nothing shocking to them to hear this. And so he's finally free of this secret, and he's not judged by his fellow AA members. And I love this because once again it shows you the importance of that community of people who can relate, people who have been where you've been. And so there's things that you might just feel so much shame and guilt about. And maybe if you told it to someone who isn't in AA, maybe they would judge you. But because you're telling it to people who know what it's like to be where you've been, it's a safe space where you can share those things. And I mentioned this in my episode for The Shining, but I'm not a member of AA, but I do go to Al-Anon meetings, which is like the sister meeting to AA. And Al-Anon is for people who have a loved one who are an alcoholic. Because having a relationship of any kind, whatever the relationship is, with someone who's an alcoholic can be very difficult, of course. And even though you're sober, you can still do things that make no sense and do things that you're ashamed about and feel guilt over. But again, the meeting, Al-Anon meetings, is that safe place where you can share, and people get it because they've been in your shoes before. You know, there's things with AA and Al-Anon that I don't totally agree with, but for the most part, I think it's great and it's free. And if you're struggling with addiction or know someone struggling with addiction, definitely seek out those meetings in your area because they're a great resource, and it just helps so much to have that sense of community. And again, I just want to say how much I love too that this book is a story about breaking the cycle of addiction in your family, and how that's not an easy thing to do, but this last moment where Dan is celebrating his 15th birthday, he was able to do what his dad had not been able to do. And so it's just such a powerful moment, and that's the moment in the book that made me cry, because I just love stories about that, about people breaking that cycle of addiction, because that is not easy. I just love that Dan survives in the end of the book and is living a healthy, happy life. And then after this, the very end of the book, Dan is guiding someone else into death, and it is a guy who was mean in real life, or not in real life. It was a guy who was mean when he was living, and Dan did not like him, and yet when he's passing on, Dan is as kind to him as he is to anybody else, and gives him the grace and the forgiveness and helps him ease into death. And it was just a really beautiful scene. But before I go to book versus movie, I wanted to share some movie thoughts, because there were a lot of things I loved about the movie that I didn't really touch on. For starters, we see people who are like recapturing Wendy, DeColorin, and Jack, and Danny, young Danny. And like they were good, but I think the guy who played DeColorin, I thought he was great. So I thought he captured the spirit of DeColorin the best from the old movie. And then also the scene where Abra gets in Rose's head while Rose is in the store, and then Rose tries to turn it and get in Abra's head. Like that was such a fantastic scene in the movie. It was so cool the way it was done. Like Rose is in the store and then the glass breaks and she falls, and the way they will slide on the floor into each other's minds. And then when Rose tries to break into Abra's mind using the files, and then she gets stuck, her hand gets stuck in there, and then she gets the spotlight on her, and then Abra in turn goes inside Rose's mind, and it was just so well done. And that would be hard to adapt, right, when I was reading it, but the way they did it was so cool. And when Rose gets her hand stuck, oh man, it was just such a great scene, and it was so awesome the way they filmed those parts. And same with when Dan goes in Abra's mind when she's been kidnapped by Crow. We have him sliding down the floor into her mind, and yeah, I love those scenes so much. It was so cool. And also the way Rose travels through space to get to Abra's mind, and then when she is kicked out of Abra's mind, she's flying through space back to her body. Such a great scene. I loved those parts so much. And then I do want to say that we do get red rum in both the book and the movie. In the book, I think it was in a dream, but in the movie, Abra writes murder on the blackboard when the baseball boy scene happens, but then Dan sees it through a mirror, so the way he sees it, it says red rum. So I thought that was a really cool scene. And also he's renting that apartment, so his landlady, when she went to his apartment, because eventually he died, but so when she goes up to his apartment and she sees that the word murder is there on his chalkboard, what was going through her mind when she saw that? But anyway, moving on to book versus movie though. So I know there were complaints with the third act of this movie, how there were too many moments that were recreating The Shining, but honestly, I loved it and I wasn't bothered by it. And I watched Chris Stuckman's review for this movie, and he talked about how he agreed that he thought it was good and it wasn't overdone. And he made the point that they didn't do these callbacks until the last 30 minutes of the movie. So it's not like the movie was relying on these fan service moments all throughout. Granted, they do have little callbacks tracks throughout the movie, but it's not done strongly until the end. And so the first 2 hours of the movie hold up really well on its own, and then the ending, you get these recreation moments. And yeah, maybe there were certain things they could have left out, but for the most part, I was totally on board and I did not mind at all. And again, I absolutely loved that they used the book ending for the ending of Doctor Sleep, since that ending was fantastic, and we did not get that in the movie The Shining. I love the movie, but yeah, that ending was fantastic, and so I love that we finally got to see it play out on screen. I know there's the miniseries, but I haven't seen it and I've heard it's not very good. Anyway, so I love that they included that. And like I said with the book, you could go into it not having read the first one, and I think you would be fine. Whereas with the movie, I do think the people who will enjoy it most are people who have read Doctor Sleep, people who have read The Shining, and people who have seen The Shining. So I think it's best to go into the movie having that background. But as far as to say which one wins, this is really tough because the movie follows the book so closely for the first 2/3. But I do like that they did make some changes so that the good guys don't win quite so easily as they did in the book, and that they do suffer some losses. I actually like that in the movie, because in the book it was just too easy. Everything always went according to plan. But honestly, yeah, I don't know, but I love that Dan lives in the end of the book, where he dies in the end of the movie, and I don't think that was necessary. But I am tempted to say the movie wins, though, just because it was such a great combination of Doctor Sleep the book, The Shining the movie, and the performances were incredible. So yeah, I don't know. I'm tempted to say, well, I don't know, but then the book is so great too, with just Dan's story and his recovery and being able to do what his dad wasn't able to do, and just living a healthy, happy life in the end, despite everything he's been through. That was fantastic. I don't know. I really love the movie too, though. I'm having a hard time deciding. Initially, I thought the movie won, but now I'm almost thinking that maybe the book wins. Oh, this is really tough. I think for now, maybe I'll say the movie wins, because that's what I initially had put, but as I'm talking about it, now I'm thinking that maybe the book wins. But, I'll just say the movie wins for now. My mind might change about that, because there were certain aspects of the book. Well, and also his Doctor Sleep thing was so much bigger in the book, and I love that, and it was so beautiful. His scenes where he does that in the movie, though, are also really beautiful and well done. It's just not as often. Anyway, I'm saying the movie. It was really good. I loved it. Highly recommend it. And thank you guys for joining me for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Give it a thumbs up. Let me know your thoughts down below on what you think of this, especially if you think the movie used too many fan service moments, or if you were on board and you didn't mind it like me. Thank you for watching. Sorry, my voice is getting all raspy now, so I will say goodbye. And yeah, don't forget to subscribe. Bye.